Hey guys, and welcome back to Hoosier Hardware, and once again we have my Windows server out and about, and yeah, today we're looking at this cooler that is now perfectly attached to this server, and it is as quiet as ever. So we're going to be taking a look at the Noctua NH-D9L. Yeah, I totally didn't memorize the name of the cooler that I'm using. Awesome. So as we get started here today with the NH-D9L, if this video gets 1,000 likes, I'll build a Linux server for my home lab, probably using the same case. But you know what? Also in those comments down below, let me know what your home lab setup is. Let's hop into talking about this Noctua cooler in a 3U form factor. So before I get into the process of actually installing the NH-D9L, wow, I still can't memorize that, the NH-D9L, I do want to talk a little bit about why I put this particular cooler in this particular chassis, and it really comes down to this other cooler that I had that was running in this chassis. Now, I, in a previous video, put together this Windows server, or probably more accurate to say that I actually took all the components out of an old Windows server, swapped some of them out, and then put together this particular server. And just so you know, it has a Ryzen 9 3900X and 32 gigabytes of DDR4 memory, has a GT 1030, just so I have a video output. It's what I had laying around, and it's a passive card, so it's perfectly quiet as well. The one thing I didn't like about this particular case is the two fans that were up front were quite noisy, so I replaced them with a 120 millimeter fan. However, I did have to mount that in there with zip ties. You know what though, it does the job just fine and does give pretty good airflow with better acoustics overall. Now originally the 47K here, this ID cooling cooler was cooling the 3900X in the server, but it was only in there because it was the sort of lowest profile, highest performing cooler I had. That is, all of my tower coolers were just too large for a 3U server. Many of them would fit into a 4U server, but 3U was just a little bit too low profile for those coolers. So I reached out to Noctua and asked them specifically about this cooler because notably it has a badge on the box that's very important to me right now, and that is that it is fully 3U compliant. That is, it should fit in pretty much any 3U server chassis that doesn't have any sort of weird overhanging bits over the CPU socket. So Noctua agreed to send it out, which big thanks goes out to Noctua because I knew it would be a fantastic cooler from the get-go, and as we're going to see here in some of these this testing that I did, it is pretty great at doing exactly what I need it to do. And just so we're clear here, the IS47K is not a bad cooler. I actually really like this cooler, just not for this use case. And by the way, as we start to look at the thermals here and the improvements that I got out of this cooler, I will mention that both this cooler as well as the 47K are linked down in the description down below in case you need a very low profile cooler or something this 3U compliant. Either one of these coolers are fantastic in their own rights for their own use cases. They're linked down below. So jumping into IDA64 with the IS47K, keep in mind that I had downclocked this thing originally, the 3900X, down to a manual just 3 gigahertz across the board, and that was basically because at 3 gigahertz I could actually run it at like 100% usage and not have a lot of thermal issues and also keep the noise down. So when I put it back to auto and let the 3900X just kind of do its thing, you'll notice as the test goes along, and this test was only run for about 5 minutes, the 3900X started to throttle itself back because it was hitting that thermal limit that is introduced by just not having enough cooling capacity to cool a 3900X when it's running at full bore. Additionally, when the IS47K ramps up its fan, it does turn into a little bit of a jet engine type of a scenario. So it's not only not quite keeping the 3900X fully under control when it comes to thermals, it's also extremely loud, which this server does run in my basement, so it wouldn't be a huge deal, but I do like walking past the stairs and not actually hearing any of my servers whatsoever, so I did want to get those acoustics under control as well, and that's where the Noctua NH-D9L enters. And at stock, the NH-D9L at face value does what I'm setting out to do. First and foremost, it keeps thermals a little bit more under control. Now, it's not that it keeps thermals extremely low. We're not talking about a CPU cooler here that's keeping the 3900X around 50 degrees Celsius or 60 or even 70 degrees Celsius. If I'm running this thing out full bore for an extended period of time, yes, it's gonna get quite warm. But two things are key here. First and foremost, the 3900X is not throttling itself way back like it was with the IS-47K. And number two, acoustically, this thing is much, much quieter than the 47K. Now, part of the thermal gains are, obviously just basic physics. There's just more mass to the NH-D9L than there is with the IS-47K, but beyond that, the NH-D9L as a tower style cooler is actually pulling air in from the front of the chassis and pushing it on back out the back of the chassis, whereas the IS-47K being actually I believe that one's an updraft cooler. Regardless, as a cooler with a fan that is not mounted in sort of this horizontal passing air through the chassis type manner, it's not really doing a great job expelling the air out the back of the case like the NH-D9L does. Additionally, the NH-D9L does come with clips so that you can mount a second 92mm fan to this tower cooler. Now, I suspect that you wouldn't actually get huge gains in your thermal performance by doing that, but if you need a little bit better airflow getting through the CPU cooler, that is another option that you do have available to you. So this isn't really a review of the NH-D9L, it's really just kind of going over the why I picked the NH-D9L and why it's sitting in my 3U server. Realistically, this server very seldom actually sees its CPU performance hitting anywhere near 100% utilization. That is, when I'm hitting with something heavy, it's usually somewhat bursty. Like if it's transcoding a video, it's not doing it for hours on end, it's doing it for a few minutes or something like that. So the NH-D9L is going to do a great job of keeping the CPU temperature under control. It's going to be able to run the 3900X right at about 4 gigahertz across all 12 cores and 24 threads. And under normal usage, when I'm doing just minor things in the background with this server, when it's just humming along with very low utilization, the CPU is going to be ice cold with the NH-D9L. It does a fantastic job for what I need it to. And really, with a 3U server like this, if you wanted just over-the-top better cooling, you would about have to start thinking about transitioning to an AIO or even a custom loop if you're going to go more exotic than a 3U server sort of tower cooler here that Noctua has, because this thing does have 2 towers on it with 4 copper heat pipes. There's really not a lot more you can do with the height restrictions of a 3U server than what Noctua has here with their NH-D9L. So again, those are linked in the description down below, and once again, in those comments, let me know what your home server setup is. Do you have a server rack? Do you just have maybe a PC over in the corner that operates as a server? Let me know all your thoughts on home labs, home servers, and of course, if you like this video and you want to see more about my home lab and things that I'm doing with it, give this video a like, share, subscribe, and comment. All those things are very helpful for the channel. You can follow me both on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware, and as always, I'll let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane with Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.